after nearly 2 months, the results from the DNA test that was performed on a 2,000-year-old elongated skull from Paracas, Peru, are finally in.
I don't understand. Why this legend of a city of gold?
The Luga word for gold translates as treasure. Their treasure wasn't gold, it was knowledge. Knowledge was their treasure.
Even more confounding is the fact that many of these megalithic constructions were built in impractical locations, often thousands of feet above sea level.
This is your nautical lantern on the dangerous seas of darkness. Let's push off from the placid shore of the status quo and explore what's beyond the horizon. I am your host, BT, and this is Truth and Shadow, your podcast of the supernatural.
There are places on this earth that defy explanation. Not just in theory, but in presence. You don't need to be a scholar or a believer to feel it. The air changes, the ground speaks, and if you're listening close enough, something older than history whispers back. Peru is one of those places. From the soaring terraces of Machu Picchu to the forgotten megaliths buried deep in the jungle, Peru is not just an archaeological wonder. It's a provocation, a riddle, a wound in the earth where time bleeds out slowly and secrets refuse to die. We often refer to these sites as pre-Columbian, but I'm convinced that it's only because we ran out of ways to say pre-everything. In the highlands and the deserts, the ancient world remains suspiciously intact. Cyclopean stonework that fits together so tightly, a sheet of paper can't pass between the joints. Walls carved not with bronze tools, but seemingly with intention beyond our current understanding. Shapes are melted, edges are rounded, gigantic stones that would challenge our cranes today, yet were somehow moved and stacked by hands? Or minds? These ruins weren't merely homes or temples, they were statements, signposts, gateways, and perhaps even prisons for something long buried. Now, if you listen to the academic consensus, the story is simple. Clever people, rudimentary tools, a lot of time, and a little luck. But that narrative, comfortable as it may be, feels more like a lullaby meant to soothe us to sleep than to give us an answer that truly satisfies. Because Peru doesn't feel ancient, it feels antediluvian. The very stones remember a world that was swept away, a world the Bible calls before the flood, a time when, according to ancient texts and whispered traditions, the boundaries between heaven and earth were not yet secure. When divine beings cast down in rebellion walked among men, and their hybrid offspring built kingdoms that towered to the sky and dug chambers deep in the bones of the earth. Genesis 6 says, "The sons of God saw the daughters of men," and you know the rest. But what if the memory of their work survived not in story alone, but in the stone? I'm not saying little green men built the Andes. I am saying that the architecture we see in places like Sacsayhuaman, Ollantaytambo, and even the Nazca Plateau, these aren't the fingerprints of some forgotten tribe. They're the remnants of something larger, something that was here before the myth of progress rewrote the map. And when you stand in those places, when the wind catches just right, and the mountains cast their long shadows over the valley floors, you feel it. Some would call it extraterrestrial, others call it angelic. I lean toward the latter because the fallen sons of heaven were not only cast down, they were cast among us. And they didn't come empty-handed. They brought knowledge, technology, and perhaps the very tools that shaped the foundations of forgotten empire. So here's what I propose. Just a hypothesis, you understand. What if Peru isn't simply an archaeological treasure trove? What if it's a warning label? What if those megaliths are markers from a time when giants walked the earth and the veil between realms was gossamer thin? The stones seem to speak, but they don't flatter us. They speak of a greatness we have not inherited, and maybe a fall we've tried to forget. That's why I find Peru so fascinating. Not because I'm looking for aliens, but because I'm looking for truth. A truth older than empire, older than civilization. A truth that once shook the mountains and still echoes faintly through the stone. And I want to believe, but maybe the truth was never up there. Maybe it was buried all along down here. The past is not a mystery. It's a crime scene. Beneath our feet, in the dust of forgotten civilizations, lie artifacts of our ancestors. Whispers of lost knowledge, buried truth, and stories that some have chosen to forget. But some would rather erase the past than preserve it, trading humanity's legacy as a commodity, a relic to be stolen, sold, or silenced. Antiquarianism and archaeology are more than just academic pursuits. They are the last defense against the destruction of history itself. Every artifact uncovered, every temple restored, every ancient script deciphered brings us closer to understanding who we were and perhaps who we were meant to be. Yet across the world, looters, war, neglect, and businesses threaten to erase these connections forever. What we fail to protect today may be lost to us tomorrow. In this episode, we're uncovering the struggle to preserve our shared past before it's too late. And to introduce us to this topic is our guest. He is the creator of Pillars of the Past, the heritage activist, the cultural steward, and antiquities watchdog. Welcome, Raul, to Truth and Shadow Podcast.
Thanks for having me, Brandon. That was a great introduction. I'm going to have to steal some of those titles. They're very fitting, and I did not think of them myself, so thank you for that.
You're welcome, of course. So we'd interacted before on another podcast, the Unrefined podcast, with Brandon Spain and Lindsay Waters. And we had talked about some things there that I thought would be really great if we would just dive in a little bit deeper, and that's specifically talking about the value of antiquarianism and the value of archaeology. And a lot of these two should be working in tandem and together. And so why don't you take some time and tell the audience about yourself, why you're passionate about this and what it is you do.
All right. Sounds good to me. Well, I agree with you that especially in the places I've been. So, I'm the creator of Pillars of the Past, and primarily my research, my investigations, and my expeditions have been focused in Peru. And Peru is part of my personal heritage. My mother is from Peru, so growing up, my father was always very adventurous. He wanted to we went all over when I was a kid. And so that really embodied in me this love for the culture, this wonder about the ancient archaeological sites that were there, who the people were, and the history. And so, and growing up, we would go there every year and a half to all these different places. And as I've gotten older, and it has only been relatively recent, my channel's only existed for a year and a month now. But I started using Google Earth, and when I was down in Peru, I was looking for ambiguous ruins I could probably go to. And from having grown up going to these places, I know that there's ruins everywhere in Peru. I mean, there is no lack of ancient architecture. And a lot of them are unexcavated. And unless it's a big major site that has financial backing or interest from universities, these sites are just kind of just sitting there. And a lot of times the Ministry of Culture knows about them. You'll see signs there that, they have a label. However, on my expeditions, I've been to a few that did not have labels. My main goal is to investigate, capture, document these sites for several reasons. One, because there's so much history there. They are unexcavated. I haven't been to a single site that hasn't been looted in some capacity. So there's that. And I mean, that's a continual thing that's happening. And then also there's the advance of, agriculture and these expansive efforts that are literally paving over ancient archaeological sites. And these are sites that have not had the funding, have not had the necessary backing of the government or other universities to fund research at these sites. So what was there, and there's a handful of them that I've been to that literally have orchards planted over them. And it's not that things were buried, they were demolished. And I just can't help but think what is being lost, and so the goal of Pillars of the Past is to eventually create enough awareness of these ancient sites, hopefully find a handful of them that will engender some interest from, financing parties who would fund some sort of archaeological excavation, things of that nature, maybe some neat fancy equipment like ground penetrating radar, things like LiDAR, because these sites, once they're gone, and you won't ever know what part they played in the cultural legacy of the history in those areas. And doing things like 3D mapping using the drone, I plan to provide that to the government whenever I establish a proper contact or channel through them. But just because this stuff needs to be preserved.
Yeah, fantastic. And then, do you have any background in archaeology at all, or is this a hobby?
This is. When I went to college, I studied world religions and history. And, you and I were speaking before this podcast. It is an undergraduate, just a few undergraduate classes. But with my history and my background, having been to Peru, having been to all these sites, it's been a personal endeavor over decades of personal research, personal investigation, and personal experience.
Yeah, it sounds like the major drive here is really to encourage people to take the fields of archaeology seriously, and serious enough that governments around the world should be looking at their own cultural background and their own sites and doing something that's very similar. In the United States, if you want to build a business or whatever, you have to have it surveyed by an archaeological team. And if and the survey comes back that there's remains of some sort, you can either get a thumbs up or a thumbs down depending upon what's found. And that's not happening in other parts of the world.
No, it is not. There are, so my approach to this has been initially, I've just used Google Earth, everyday satellite imagery that anybody can use. And I just became really good at identifying these ancient sites. I'd find something that didn't have a label. I'd make the arduous journey to get there, and lo and behold, there's ruins. And so far, I've been 100% accurate with every single place I assumed, which is amazing. But every now and then, when I use the Google Maps, I need to roll the satellite date back to get a better, seasonal view of structures. And when I started to do that in a couple locations, I would notice that there were a lot more ruins there 10 years ago. And I start to look at what happened. And all of a sudden there's, some sort of agricultural plantation that's been put there. And these aren't, and I've been to them. I went to some of them to verify this. And these aren't locals that are, it is a much bigger operation than any local could afford to produce. These are, from my understanding, from my viewpoint, corporations that have come in, and look, there's no oversight, and you think, the bureaucracy of the government is in Lima. They're not sending people out there, and there's so many sites they really even couldn't send enough people out there. And so it's kind of like the Wild West out there. If they want this property, they will just do it themselves. And who knows what they're finding and what's been put on the black market, things of that nature. And what's worse is that there's no penalties because nobody's going out there to witness this stuff. The other side of it is, even if there are penalties, the money that will come from there and agricultural investment outweighs the fine that might be imposed on them. So they're kind of just willing to do it one way or the other.
So something that's actually kind of an interesting idea, and let's just look at why is Peru considered one of the world's most important archaeological regions? I mean, what is it in Peru that makes some of their ancient culture so distinct and unique?
You could throw a stone on a map and find some piece of historical architecture, some remnants of some ancient culture. It is so abundant in Peru, and we're talking everywhere. We're talking every single region from the coast. Then you make the ascent up into the Andes. There's everything. People were living in those valleys for thousands and thousands and thousands of years. And so, I mean, it was just a hotspot for these cultures. And then you go cross the Andes down into the Amazon basin, and they were building and living everywhere.
Yeah, and we're talking about peoples like, who do we have in Peru? That'd be the Inca. Well, the Inca were the Nazca, and
so you have the Inca, the Moche, the Nazca, Chavin culture, Paracas, the Chimu, and all in the Lima culture, which was several valleys north and south of Lima. It's actually when I believe it was when Pizarro wanted, they moved the capital from Cusco to Lima, which is why it's now the capital. But I mean, there's structures. There's Huacas. Huaca is like an isolated temple, an isolated structure, and they're all over downtown Lima. And my last expedition, I went up and down the coast, and I mean, people were living in every single valley, for thousands of years. So it's just such a rich location for history.
Yeah, and you mentioned kind of some at the beginning, the differences between local residents or local individuals taking something from a site and then reusing it. An example today is some of the stuff recovered near Karahan Tepe in Turkey, where they have found that people have lived there for thousands of years. And every once in a while, the earth is shifting or moving around and things get uncovered, and you have people taking and using things that are from these sites that are 10,000 plus years old. And it's a pretty common thing. I mean, it's kind of a headache for archaeologists because they really would like to know where something came from before people are taking it. But at the end of the day, the reality is this isn't what's really happening in Peru. I mean, we have sites like Machu Picchu and a couple of other massive cultural heritage sites that are recognized, I think, by UNESCO. But really, like you said, there's things everywhere in Peru, and people are hawking wares.
I mean, that's absolutely true. To your point, what you said in the beginning just here about modern people reusing what the ancients. One of the best examples of that is the aqueducts of the Inca. And really that was kind of the worry that established that. The Inca just adopted it. The Inca weren't around very long. But they absorbed all these different cultures. And so with that came the methodology and the approach to irrigation. But these irrigation channels are still being used today. I mean, in Cusco for sure, and Ollantaytambo, you can still see the original irrigation systems. But even on the coast, down in Nazca too, which predate, the modern dating of things like structures in Cusco. By thousands of years, they still have the wells, and so, and their approach, and specifically that region is incredibly unique because it's a coastal desert, and you really have to know what you're doing in order to be able to grow things there, and they do, and then people are they have their farms, and it's because these underground aquifers, they just knew how to tap into them. And the modern people know that because they're still using the same ones that their ancient ancestors were using.
So if we were to look at something specific, what is a key area that you find is the most problematic with the preservation of sites? I mean, like you said, there's no government agency really coming in and taking an interest in this. Where should we look first?
That's a good question. The problem is everywhere. Let's be clear about that. There's, like I said, there's not a single site that I went to that hadn't been looted in some capacity. The thing that stands out to me most when you ask that question are things in the Nazca and Paracas region, mainly because I must have come across 12 different massive burial sites, and these are all on my channel, Pillars of the Past 101 on YouTube, or everything's linked at pillarsofthepast.com. But you're at these burial sites, and as far as you can see, it's just the human skeletal remains of ancient mummies. And the way you know that they were ancient mummies is because of how they used to bury their deceased. They would wrap them in cotton and rope and textile. And I mean, going to these sites was really shocking. I didn't know what to expect. I saw looting pits, and if you use Google Earth, you can see these looting pits from space. It looks like the surface of the moon, and that's how rampant and insidious the looting has been. But the reason I say that, to answer your question primarily, is because this is just on the surface. The skeletal remains, the mummies, the artifacts, they're all there. And, to think if you don't preserve that, or you don't take samples when you can, you don't know what's going to be there next year or not be there, And so for me, that was part of my mission to document, not disturb, but document what is there currently. Now, if I'm being honest, I didn't come across a single looter anytime at any of, so I don't know when it's happening. I don't know if these places have been tapped as far as these people are concerned or not. But the other thing is, at these places, you'll see architecture peeking itself out of one of these looting pits. So there's structure that is buried a couple meters down, and nobody has any idea what it might look like. So that's it. So that for like human remains standards, that would be that should be a primary focus. But then also up north, you see it there too all the time. And I mean, some of the personal areas of interest that I would love to have studies done with ground penetrating radar and reassessing and redoing some radiocarbon dating at some of these sites. They're to the north.
Right. And, some of these challenges that are faced, besides, it's like you pull up the satellite images and then you look and you notice that there's some discrepancies between what your current mapping images and an older map image. And it doesn't take a whole lot of investigation to figure out what's going on. And what I'm wondering is how would I frame this? Let's just look at some of the examples that you've used. You've done a lot of YouTube videos in this. What kind of positive effects has utilizing the technology from drones to satellite imagery? What positive effects have we seen on people and the desire to preserve some of these sites, maybe in Peru or elsewhere, really?
Well, I do know that there are efforts by the government that if looting happens to be reported, for example, they will send drones out to go scout or, scare the looters away. Like I said, I haven't seen anybody out there loot. I will say, though, when I was at a couple of sites, some local individual who was living close to it saw me, walking around this site and came and asked me, what I was doing. And so I don't know if they're part of the community kind of just, watching over things or not. I didn't really, it's very possible. But I know that there's no affiliation with any sort of, governmental agency, for example. It's I purposefully went to obscure sites. So I don't know if, and I went to obscure, not easy to get to sites. And I say that because at easier to get to sites that are kind of closer to being off the main road and things, there'll be boundary stones and things of that nature to kind of highlight that this is an archaeological site. And typically that's also because those sites have been surveyed in some capacity. But some of these other places I went to that are at the peaks of mountains, for example, that nobody's traveling there. And thank God I had the drone, because there were, certain mountains I couldn't scale. And so, I was able to send that up and get an aerial survey of what a site might look like. Ironically, at those places I couldn't get to, there were still looting pits that you could see from the. Wow. So people had been there. You know what I mean?
Still doing it.
Yeah. And I think I quoted this in one of the videos, but there's been more looting in the last 2 decades of the 20s. So the 1980s and 1990s were really bad. And there's been more looting in that 20-year period than the 500 years prior. Now, it's the Spanish, they were looting the hell out of things. They were intentionally torturing to find out where people were keeping their burials and all that. And so there was a lot of looting that started then. But there is also, I do know that in the Nazca regions, for example, there are a couple of huaqueros is what a looter is called. There's a couple of huaqueros that go out looking for things. They'll find these elongated skulls, and I'm sure some of them probably make it to the black market. I don't even know what that entails, but they also sell them to museums, the local museums down there. Or you ask them, "Where'd you get all this?" He's like, "Oh, my guy, goes out on the weekends and digs."
Yeah.
And so, and honestly, I'd rather have it that way. I mean, I hate to say it, but it's in a museum at least. It's this guy getting a little. It's also the poverty there is extreme. I mean, it's bad, and so there is a level of understanding that I have personally, recognizing the couple of bucks that these people might make. And a lot of times there's so much stuff in Peru that they might just be, trying to irrigate their personal farmland and come across something. I ran into several people like that, who just came across a whole pot, and if they can sell it for a few bucks, to make ends meet, then hopefully it goes to a museum. Hopefully it goes into the proper hands. But there's a lot of other people who prey on these people who get those, and then they know what to do with the, foreign markets or whatever.
Yeah, I was thinking about, some of these artifacts, some of these items that are found, the Paracas skulls, the mummies that are found. A lot of these were relatively unheard of. Archaeologists have admitted that there has been a cultural tradition of skull, of head binding, where you take your infant and you strap them very securely to a board, and it forces the skull to grow in a certain way. But as people are digging around in the Paracas area and they're bringing in these skulls, they're not just being recovered to museums. They are being sold to private individuals, and some of those private individuals have gone so far as to say these are not bound skulls. These are natural occurring formations of a human head, and I think, or well, maybe not even human, but I think that the more people who basically take and blow up, make people aware of sites in Peru, the more that we are starting to see evidences that may not be in line with the mainstream archaeological narrative. And the question is how do these any kind of discoveries that are made, either from simple finding temple sites to remains, be it human remains or otherwise, how do these new discoveries force people like historians to reevaluate our traditional narratives regarding ancient civilization?
I mean, that's a great question I think about a lot, especially in I don't think I've been around for 40 years, and this is the most heated time that has existed when it comes to archaeology and its approach to things. So really quick on the skulls. So there's two there. There's cranial deformation, which is what you're talking, the head binding, which does happen. But then there are other, like real elongated skulls that are actually like missing a suture that would typically be found in most. And I mean, what I don't understand is what, we have all these different classes of hominids. Why is this not being considered? I mean, you don't have to go with some extremely far out theory. But even to be open-minded enough to say, hey, maybe this should be another classification. I don't know enough about the intricacies of, the studies of the bones that people in that field need to make such a determination. But to answer your question about, I have to say that if we take a step back in the world of archaeology, there is a big distinction between Western archaeology, and when I mean Western archaeology, I mean really United States archaeology, because there are a lot of archaeologists, well-known archaeologists from other countries, from Germany or France or wherever, South American archaeologists that that don't subscribe to the kind of dating on things that we've been prescribed here in the United States on migration patterns, on how old things are. There seems to be a lot more open-mindedness in other countries, in other fields of archaeology, studies of archaeology. Now, what it takes is, unfortunately, I mean, like Tom Dillahay is one of the best examples I could bring up. He's the one who discovered Monte Verde, which, is a settlement down in Chile, which, dates back to, pre-Younger Dryas, pre-Cataclysm. And he discovered that and did the dating and hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of samples, and faced so much. And he's an American archaeologist, and he faced so much criticism. And it was only, in the past, couple decades that archaeology, or the broader stance of the archaeological world of the United States, agreed that, this dates back to this. But that happens all the time, where these finds are being challenged, and that's problematic, because it's problematic on a personal level to these archaeologists who've spent their life doing, researching these things. And they're not looking for personal, they're just trying to show us the record. But there's a level of rigidity, and I have my theories on why it's there. But it is apparent. And, hell, even down in Peru, when you go to the Larco Herrera Museum down in Lima, they have a map of the world, and they show the migration patterns of ancestors. And they have a direct, coming from Asia, they have a direct line going through, Easter Island and over into Peru from it. We don't have that here. You know what I mean? We for the longest time, it's the Bering Strait idea, but, and so this is a big name museum down in Peru that is saying that these cultures, civilization was populated coming from across an ocean, which a lot of people are very quick to dismiss.
Yeah, it's hard because the evidence is showing that the cultures in places like Peru and Chile are far older than some of the indigenous peoples in North America, which is also kind of hard because a lot of the North American tribes people didn't keep or didn't maintain physical structures, right? It was like, what do you do when you're a nomad? You don't really you just keep moving around. But yeah, you're absolutely right when it comes to skulls too. It wasn't a whole lot of evidence found to support the idea of Ardipithecus, for example, found in Africa, specifically Ethiopia. So it really wouldn't be all that hard for someone to just take one of these skulls that has these missing sutures, the paraphium or whatever it's called, the ferromagnum, excuse me, that's at the base of your skulls in a different location. It wouldn't be very hard for them to just go, this is
Ardipithecus, or Andropithecus for the Andes Mountains, or, I mean, it really wouldn't be all that difficult for them to just say that, yeah, you're right, we found a whole nother human species, a hominid species, and just all of a sudden, then everybody, it's like, oh, it's aliens, goes out the window, right? I mean,
and that's, I also think that I was thinking about this when you let me know what the topics we were going to be discussing here today. I wonder, and this is all speculation because I'm not in the brains of these people, but I wonder if there's this, give an inch, take a mile type of mentality where it's like if we buck a little bit on this, then all of a sudden we're opening the door to when really it shouldn't be. That shouldn't even be a thought. It's like stick with what is there, what you see, what you test. Put a lid. And to your point, I don't know exactly which class of hominid, but I know that there are where they've only found one or two skulls, and all of a sudden there's a whole hominid species attributed to it, and here you have I mean, you got museums full of these things down in Ica. So, I mean, it would not be a stretch to say, and it's, like I know Brian Forrester, for example, has been a big proponent of doing research and studies on these skulls, but it just shocks me that, major universities aren't leaping at the opportunity.
Yes, because what we know specifically, here's a good example. From the Caucasus Mountain Range area, we have the Denisovans, and all that was found there is some bone fragments, some teeth, and miscellaneous genetic material.
Yeah.
We don't have a complete skull. We have a finger bone, a large molar tooth, and a fragment of a jawbone. And we have the Denisovans. And so that amount of evidence versus an entire skull. I mean, because for example, Ardipithecus, we have a skull of Africans, some of the Lucy, what we call Lucy, and a couple of others that were found in Ethiopia area a long while ago. So we have skulls of those, but we don't even have that for an entire. And I misspoke. It was found in China. It's a Kuhan cave in China, is where we found that, and the Denisovan cave in Siberia. So we have the two locations. I misspoke about the Caucasus Mountains, but at the end of the day, the evidence that is available, all that we are left to do is speculate. And because we're speculating, this allows the spread of misinformation. And I think that is something that individuals like yourself are working to to eradicate by bringing evidence and real life footage. It's nothing that it's just a couple of talking heads saying that this is what these things are or showing. It's real life footage and evidence that there's something going on that we need to be aware of.
I mean, and my goal is to, I'm pretty careful when it comes to integrating my personal ideas into, like when I'm showing the footage, I am like, hey, come with me, see what I'm seeing. If you have ideas, I love the comments on these YouTube videos because I don't know. I found this one artifact and I thought it might have been a head wrap, and there are 7 people in the comments who were like, "This looks like what they used to throw stones." And I was like, "Oh wow, you know what? It does. I didn't even think of that." And so that's, what, and it feels more of like a collaborative approach to this, and so. And I don't want to. I try very hard not to suggest things one way. I do say like, this is what's said. Here are some theories, But at the end of the day, you see what I see, and you decide, And that's going to continue to be my approach. But there are, going back to, I spoke with Dr. Ed Barnhart, going back to Tom Dillahay, and, the dating on things. There's no doubt in my mind that there are older settlements that, radiocarbon dating has been, has had its issues in the past. And you just got to get a lot of samples and you're coming up with an estimate. But there's a lot of sites that have been carbon dated and, all right, this is what this is. Our hands are done. We can move on. And then all of a sudden, one rogue archaeologist is like, all right, well, let me check this out and find something substantially different. There are so many places like that. And just on the coast of Peru, and the way I think too is, if there were seafaring capacities, you're going to start to settle on the coast. There is other evidence, though, that's starting to come from, where there's 8,000-year-old pottery on the other side of, the Amazon, and it makes its way across onto the west coast of Peru. But, Tom Dillahay dated Huaca Prieta, and for the longest time they thought that was, that couldn't have been, 2,500 years old. All of a sudden it's 6,000 years old and probably a little older than that. There's sites up and down the coast that are just like that.
Yeah, I think one of the most important things too is, we are on a quest as humans to kind of figure out who we are, why we're here, and all those regular, questions. But I think something that's important to understand about what goes on with archaeology and antiquarianism is we're looking for facts. If somebody's really trying to find truth, the best people to go to for truth would be philosophers. So go to Noam Chomsky or David Chalmers for truth. If you want some facts, that there were people in Peru and they got there most likely from the water, from ocean. They're Peloponnesian island hoppers before they came to the South American continent. You're going to find that evidence, and I think that there's plenty that supports that. And I think what's important is media, right? For many of us, we grew up where our news media was presented to us by a very limited number of hosts, right? And today, that news media it's just wide open. There is one person for every thought that can give us any kind of spin that we want. And I find that it really took the advent of and the understanding of social media, if I were to say 2007, as a real pivotal moment in the history of man when it came to news media. I'd probably be spot on. And I think that's been your experience too, is we have more people interested, invested, and curious about the world in this last, dare I say, 20 years than before.
Yeah, and it's well, especially with the newer generations that are coming up, and going to things like YouTube for information, and right. To be able to have a platform for some of the alternative information, because occasionally, yes, there are people who are just, putting theories out there and very loose with what's been found and connecting dots that aren't in the same constellation.
Right.
But there's other researchers out there who have sent things to labs and have, invested a lot of personal time and where that stuff isn't necessarily getting published. In the peer review, and when stuff does get published, there's a whole cabal of industry archaeology that is quick to shut things down. And the way I've always felt is shouldn't there at least be a conversation first? You know what I mean?
Right.
And so I think that there, and I don't know, like I said, I was thinking about this. I don't know if I try to put myself in people's shoes, and I don't know if there's some sort of undercurrent of subconscious ego that comes up where it's like, we were taught this way, this kid. And the other thing is, I don't know, just to play devil's advocate, I spent my whole life studying this. You can't tell me anything different. Well, I mean, that's a level of closed-mindedness that really, I would dare say, contradicts the whole reason a lot of these people got into this stuff in the first place. And I do understand sometimes you need to be rigid with some of the ideas and notions that are presented, some of the theories that are presented, but you can do that in a more collaborative, open-minded way. But also, if there's evidence, take a look at it. I mean, wouldn't you want to know? I don't, I don't understand the rigidity personally. Yeah. I do think that we're in a unique time where there's a lot of people on the outside looking in who are now becoming very vocal and critical to a point that is almost forcing the hand of some of the really staunchly positioned individuals to take a second. At least that's what I hope. Right. That there's a power in that movement. I also think, if I'm being honest, that both sides have their problems in their approach. There's name. I mean, it gets pretty vulgar. It escalates pretty quickly and which is all ego, and nobody's able to come together. And at the end of the day, like I said, I found in my personal experience that a lot of archaeologists and researchers in Peru naturally have much more of an open mind to these things. You just go down there to one of these sites that you're excavating, and they are a lot more open-minded to, it could be this, it could be that. And I think that's another important thing when anybody, you can say this is what the evidence suggests. Right. But to say, for a fact, we don't. You know what I mean? Yep. We have radiocarbon dates, and that's the best we can do. Yep. And that has its problems. So at the end of the day, the closed-mindedness and the slinging back and forth is not doing anybody any good. But I think it has to have come to that point in order to call out how vapid it is, I guess. Right.
Yeah, no, you're absolutely right. It reminds me, we were talking about rigidity. It reminds me of the story. Reminds me of the story of the mother who takes the ham and she cuts the ends off the ham before she puts it in the pan and then into the oven, right? And the kid's like, "Mom, why do you always cut the ends off the ham?" And she says, "Well, that's the way my mom did." So he goes to Grandma. "Grandma, why do you do it?" Well, Grandma says, "Well, that's the way my mom did it." And you go to Great Grandma, and she says, "Well, back in those days, the ovens weren't as wide as they are today, so I had to cut the ends off so it would fit in the oven." Well, so at the end of the day, why are we still cutting the ends of the ham off to get in? It doesn't follow or make any sense. And that's rigidity, right? That's a tradition that probably should be re-examined and looked at. And I'm thinking that platforms like Pillars of the Past are challenging that mainstream interpretation of history.
I hope so. I hope so. And I also aim to do that with providing a view of sites that you won't get to see unless you decide you want to scale a mountain or rough it. And I think it's important too, because who knows if some company is going to come in there next year and it's going to be gone. You know what I mean?
Right.
So, I mean, there's that aspect. I like what you said, though, like this notion of this generational kind of approach to things. And even in your example, if you surmise that, how many people were involved? Yeah, the mom, the mom's mom, the mom's mom's mom,
and then that entire generation. I mean, because all the ovens were that small.
Exactly. And I mean, that was 3 or 4 people ago.
Right.
You know what I mean? That's not that long. So it's like maybe those approaches need to be reevaluated. And I mean, that's the other thing I think. Like I don't know. I've come to this conclusion relatively recently, just being in this field, that we're still young. We have great advances in science. People have been exploring for ages, but with the modern technology and the modern capabilities, all of this has been relatively recent. The past, couple hundred years that people, but even with the technology, we're talking the past 100 years.
Right.
And sometimes it takes I tend to agree with Dr. Barnhart on this when I spoke to him and kind of asked him similar questions, that there needs to be a wall of evidence that slowly trickles in, that gradually starts to have the mainstream or the what's written in the textbooks change. There has to be so much and what my curiosity is, as soon as you get like the few pieces if the few pieces of evidence, why isn't the money going into there to figure that out?
Right.
And like, what did you want to know again? And so there becomes a stalemate.
Yeah.
And it's cost people their careers, which is the saddest thing. People who are doing this for the passion, the love, who get vindicated decades later, who after getting stripped of all their titles, which is incredibly sad.
Yeah, it's kind of an interesting thing because it, like I said, the example you did a good job pointing that out. Only a handful of individuals back. If we go back the thing is radiocarbon dating, for example, the 1940s is when this kind of began. And okay, so if radiocarbon becomes this is going to be our hardline science, and that's kind of what a lot of archaeologists are going to use, admittedly. Okay, we can use that kind of as maybe our grandparent era. And so if we go back to our great-grandparent era, that might only be the late 1800s, early 1900s. I mean, King Tut's tomb wasn't discovered until 1922.
Yep. And
the way that it was archaeologically categorized and dated was basically brand new. I think it was a result of Napoleon's conquest of Egypt and what Napoleon brought to Egypt. So we are not that far removed from when antiquarianism becomes archaeology, in the generational terms of go ask great grandma why she cuts the ends off the ham. And if we take that idea and we take it forward, we have these new things, LiDAR, 3D imaging, and even AI all seem to be impacting and influencing the way we view archaeological sites today.
I mean, absolutely. As you were saying that, I'm thinking, what did these original antiquarians kind of go off of? And
right.
And I want to say one of the biggest things they went off of were indigenous stories.
Correct.
And the historical accounts of the natives. And so there was a lot more awe, wonder, mystery, interpretation. But also, I mean, you got to consider, for all intents and purposes, that's a source account. You know what I mean? Right. And so you have this technology to, and I think, Graham Hancock kind of presents this in some of his material where it's, and this is a harsh way to put it, or a harsh way to sum it up, but that all of a sudden the technology comes and the technology should be assessed for what the technology can produce. So let's make, it has produced incredible wonders and advancements. But to allow it to completely discredit the ancestor accounts and as if our technology knows better. Yes, our technology knows these things. And so where I stand is, all right, there needs to be a combination of these things, and because again, when you went back to the original source of, the hams being cut off, you didn't know that until you went to the original source. But we have these accounts. We have the Spanish chronicle accounts and things of that nature that get us as close as we possibly can, because unfortunately, at least down in South America, there was no writing that we know of. It's funny, you talk about AI, they're using AI in Harvard now to try to analyze the quipus because, in the Spanish accounts, the quipu Kamayaks were the ones who could read the quipus. And so there's accounts of them going, the Spaniards shipping, the conquistadors shipping somebody who could read the quipus off to Spain. Okay. And there's this guy in the Spanish court reading stories off the quipus.
Oh, gotcha.
So it's not, but what we're told is that it's an accounting thing. But the other problem is, like, the conquistadors burned every single quipu they could and killed all the ones who could read it. So we're kind of shooting in the dark here. I lost my train of thought.
No, that's okay. That's good. Let's talk about the advancements that we have of technology.
Yeah. So, I mean, God, I can't wait for LiDAR to become cheaper. Right. And I mean, especially when you're looking at you can use drones to a certain extent, but for some of that deeper stuff, you need the penetration that comes from an aerial survey. From what I've learned,
even a GPR machine would be really nice if they were cheaper.
Yeah. I mean, so that's also, one of the, I hope somebody watches my stuff and it gets big enough that there can become substantial, significant partnerships that could, or some enthusiast or a university that wants to put their name on some of this stuff. There's a wealth of history out there just waiting to be analyzed and uncovered. But with the developments, going back to the indigenous accounts, you have indigenous telling people in Mesoamerica, there's cities over here, there's cities over there, and we couldn't really get there because it's in the heart of the jungle. So, all right, maybe there is, maybe there isn't. But now with LiDAR and flying over these things, I mean, they're finding 60,000 structure city in the heart of Mesoamerica. I mean, these findings are happening monthly. You know what I mean?
Yeah, even sites at Machu Picchu and Sacsayhuaman, all of these are larger than we thought they were.
Yeah, I mean, recently, just a week or two ago, they verified the tunnels that are underneath Cuzco. Again, though, the indigenous have been telling us that for generations. It's even in the Spanish accounts. So
it's like they've taken it. How do I preface this? This is the best way to preface this. There is enough oral evidence that if it was a trial, they would be found guilty. Right? There is enough spoken evidence of historical data that would be enough to convict somebody if it was a crime scene.
Well, I'm going to have to hit you with my fiance is an attorney. I'm going to have to hit you with the technicality that it'd be technically hearsay.
Technically hearsay is corroboratable by the number of number of evidence.
But actually, once you start to, that's a good point though, because once you start to corroborate those testimonies with actual, like, okay, so there are these tunnels. All right, well, this account then says this about this other location.
Yeah.
You know, oh shit, that there's something there. You know,
right. I mean, and that's exactly what it is. And that's what we're looking at when it comes to things. I mean, we have an entire indigenous population in the United States that was made up, the Hopewell and the Adena. And you come to find out that's not what they would have called themselves. And the people in the area where the Hopewell and the Adena was, quote unquote, lived, they said, the remnant peoples are like, no, that stuff was here before we got here. And so you have people that are saying one thing, and your hardliners who are like, well, no, you really don't know your own history. Let me tell it to you. And I think educational retconning of somebody else's cultural heritage is as big of a crime as destroying an archaeological site.
I agree with you. Here's a funny anecdote to that. I forget where I read this, but when the conquistadors first came to Mesoamerica and met the Maya, they were met with them saying hello, which was the word Maya. And that's from then on out, they were called the Maya. But really, their culture were the Itzas, which is why you have Chichen Itza and,
right.
and all, you know, and so
right.
There's so much of that. You know, there are wisdom keepers for reasons, you know, that have had the oral legacies passed down to them and passed down to them and passed down to them. And I mean, I think it's common sense that it's like, maybe we should pay attention. And granted that there is some of the stuff that is clearly metaphor, clearly, you know, in some of the religious myths, you know, I don't know, a hawk that dropped the rock into the ocean that created the mountains, you know, yes, yeah,
right.
you know,
right.
But let's just have some common sense about it, you know. Like,
and that's fair. That's a fair statement, that when it comes to some forms of hyperbole in our mythology, it needs to kind of be something that we're like looking at and understanding that things are allegorical. Absolutely. But when it's like, hey, look, you know, we used to have a mass city and it was located here, but we can't, you know, nobody has been able to get there because, I mean, whatever, you know, mountains. I mean, it's, what is it, the Andes down there in Peru?
yeah.
I mean, can you just imagine a culture traversing the mountains? I mean, we found like frozen remains of bodies, you know, that are old. There's a famous one that was found, and he had like a kit, and he was clearly trying to traverse the mountain range probably during summer and got waylaid and ended up not being able to make it over the mountain pass, and you know, froze to death or something like that. And I think that there's value in allegory, and I think there's value in honest to goodness story, and then being able to have individuals who have the technology to fly a drone, to give the evidence physical sustenance, you know, to actualize it.
So I'm working with these guys from the Paititi research team, and okay. Paititi was this, and you know, I have a 2.5 hour interview where I make them go through their research to convince me, you know, that they believe they've identified where this mythical city is, and they've spent 7 years researching it. And the one guy who does the map, he's a data scientist. His background is in cartography and in GIS systems, and what they were able to do, which was just, I mean, it's a great interview. I mean, I was on the edge of my seat the entire time, and with skepticism too, and they were able to answer these questions. You know, but just as an example to, you know, give the cliff notes. in these Jesuit documents, there was the mention of Paititi, and so many indigenous people were speaking of this city where the Inca were, when the conquistadors came, where the kind of Inca exodus to, that was in the heart of the, this is in the documents, a 10 days walk from Cusco, in a northeastern direction. And there's indigenous accounts where this guy was captured by the local natives, and they forced him to like hunt with them and be a part of their tribe. And there was an area they always avoided. This is just one of the several examples. I think it's an awesome one though. There's an area that this tribe avoided. He asked them why. He said, "Oh, that's from the time of the Incas. We don't go there. It's a sacred place." And so when he escaped, that's where he hid. And he hid in these temples with these huge walls. And eventually he makes it back to society. And I think it was, I forget his name, but one of the many people who have been looked for, one of the many explorers who have looked for Paititi over the last several decades, said, "Wow, this is something." He got him in a helicopter and had him retrace his steps so he could find this city. And so there's these pictures from the 1970s in this helicopter. And what Yaroslav and Ches have done, they've been able to triangulate those 1970s pictures with no GPS coordinates with actual satellite imagery and satellite mapping. And so they spent 7 years on this. And so there are a few things, like there's a waterfall, there's an artificial square lake, these little nuanced things that are in the historical accounts, and they found it all at this site. So now the next step is to do LiDAR, like you said, hopefully I'm going to be working with them later this year when we actually conduct a LiDAR survey of this little area, which would be amazing. But it's costly. You need to have investors. I don't know why, some big name billionaire who wants to, put his name on something really awesome and helpful to humanity. I mean, like this, talk about an altruistic effort, a philanthropic effort. This would be the cherry on top,
So if we just take a moment to kind of wrap up the episode, what are some of the things that you find are really important that we need to have the audience be aware of, and then how can people find more of you, Pillars of the Past?
I think the most important thing to be aware of is that there's still so much out there to be found. There's still so much we don't know. There's still, and I've witnessed it. I can personally say that there's still so much buried that has not been unearthed for millennia. It's there. The world is a big place, and so we're starting to, we've done a lot in the past, century, but as far as I'm concerned, some of these places we've only scratched the surface. And so the biggest takeaways is there are a lot of threats to these places, and that threat is passed on to us via the threat of our historical and cultural legacies that we may not ever have a chance to understand. And I would say that the biggest impediment to that is financial, really. It's financial. If the money was there, these sites could be protected. These sites could have teams excavating and researching. And with enough money, it can be done fast. That's the other thing. I know an archaeologist who's been working on the same little, piece of archaeological site for 8 years, and I'm like, I don't know how he does it. I need to be going to different sites. That's me personally. I need the adventure. So that's, we're still discovering things. So I think that's the biggest takeaway. How do we preserve? How do we explore? How do we investigate? How do we document? that's the Pillars of the Past mission, all of those things. And to find me, it's Pillars of the Past on Instagram, Pillars of the Past 101 on YouTube. You can find that all on my website, pillarsofthepast.com. And, soon I'm working on making a portal where people can come and a community can really start to form about these things, where you can see maps of every place I've gone and see the 3D imaging that I've managed to create, things of that, and participate because at the end of the day, like I said, that YouTube example was my favorite one, where I just missed it. I didn't even think about what this artifact could be. Right. And I made an assumption, and like, people's comments are helpful. People's observations can really highlight something that might not have been thought of.
Fantastic. Well, thank you very much for coming on the show. I appreciate your time.
Thanks for having me, Brandon.
Thank you for listening. This is a free podcast based upon the value for value model. If you find value in this, or any episode, you can return that value by liking the show, subscribing to this channel, leaving a review, or sharing with a friend on your social media accounts. You can also donate on my website. Thank you again. This is BT for Truth and Shadow Podcast. You are the light in the darkness.